They know that this is not a sprint. They know that they have no options. They know that, sure, they could wave a white flag, let the Russians in. And then there would be things like their children would not be able to choose where they go to school, and they would not be able to elect their government. And people could get arrested and taken away to prison for no reason at all, except that, there was an autocrat in charge and they have no influence over that and laws wouldn't count. It would just all be connections. They know that that's the alternative. They have seen it. It's right next door, and they are fighting to prevent that from happening.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of On the Edge. Our guest is Stefan Korshak, former U.S. Army. He's also an OSCE monitor in Ukraine during the Minsk Accord period of time. He's currently the senior defense correspondent for Ukraine's preeminent English language newspaper, the Kiev Post. And he also does a mighty fine vlog. So, check it out. Stefan, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Let's just start with the most easy question of all. What's your assessment of the progress of the war?
The Ukrainians are winning, but it's going slow.
And what's your assessment of the armies of both sides? What's their current condition and, their capacity, their
The Russian, okay. I'll take the Russians first. The Russians are a top-down army that is pulling mostly unwilling people into its ranks and conducting top-down attacks. So on the ground, that works out to a lot of attacks by poorly trained soldiers, followed up by smaller attacks by better trained soldiers. And the resources that they have to train those soldiers are substantial. The equipment that they can give those soldiers is, in general, adequate. And the Russian calculation is that they can keep on attacking and taking ground and killing Ukrainians longer than the Ukrainians can handle it. That's on the ground. In the air and with the missile strikes, if you will, it's the same kind of strategy, long-term bombardment and destruction of Ukraine until Ukraine can't resist anymore. Russian calculation is that they can cause death and destruction in Ukraine longer than Ukraine and its allies are willing to take it. So,
and I get the impression that they think that they can bomb the Ukrainians into submission, not realizing that actually it's kind of counterproductive. At least that's been my experience.
I would absolutely subscribe to that. There's plenty of historical precedent of people, including Americans, trying to bomb countries into submission and it failing. You and I are both old enough to remember Vietnam, and bomb them back into the Stone Age, and other people in our country would say, "Well, yeah, but the Vietnamese, they're fighting for their country, so why would they give up?" That is exactly what's going on here. It is obvious pretty much when you talk to anybody, and I talk to all sorts of people in my job. And even people who are depressed and just want it to be over and are willing to give up all sorts of things. If you ask them, well, yeah, but are you willing to just submit and let the Russians have whatever they want? Nobody says that. It's absurd. Why? So why the Russians made that calculation is, a whole different, geopolitical, cultural issue. If you, however, smoothly switch over to a discussion about the Ukrainians, what you've got is on this lower level, now you're getting quite competent fighting units. I'm seeing there are exceptions now, but I am now seeing units doing, fire and movement. I am seeing coordination with artillery. I am seeing clearing of trenches done sometimes close to the NATO standard. And what I am also seeing is use of drones on a tactical level like no army in the world does it. and I say that with confidence, and I look you straight in the eye. Seriously, the way that the Ukrainians incorporate tactical drones into their fighting on the ground is incomparable. They can teach anybody. The Russians are refusing to learn, obviously. This is very much a grassroots, bottom-up kind of tactical development. So that makes the Ukrainians on the ground, the small units in general, quite lethal, but there aren't that many of them. Any army takes casualties. The Ukrainians also. Some of the guys have been on the line now for, some of them more than 3 years, because something to remember is that this war didn't start for a lot of these guys who were fighting in February 22. They had been fighting the Russians, some of them for 5 years, some of them 8 years. So it's a tired army. Yeah. And it's an army that needs reinforcements. It's an army that needs, more than anything else, firepower. The very fact, I could go on for a long time about this, but the very fact that the Ukrainian army has figured out a way to use basically little Chinese drones, now they're making them themselves, to attack pretty much anything that moves out there on the battlefield. Where's the artillery? Where are the artillery shells? Where are the missile strikes? Where are the airstrikes? Where is all of that, NATO-type firepower? Well, the Ukrainians don't have it. They have been asking for it. It has been coming in driblets, but driblets don't really change the calculations of a very big conventional war.
But you bring up their inventiveness and their adaptability, and I would concur with that wholeheartedly. Not only in what they do with the drones, but all sorts of other technology and their tactics and the way they deploy. They're far more adaptive than what it seems the Russians. The Russians go back to the same tactics they've always had, which is mass troops and artillery and try and overwhelm with sheer numbers. Ukrainians are able to
they're flexible, they're agile, they're creative, they're all those things, but they are up against an opponent whose firepower is 4 or 5 times greater. If you look at the way that the Ukrainians aren't lying down, that's one of the things that doesn't really get out sometimes. Yes, okay, the Russians are firing missiles at Ukraine. You and I have experienced those missiles regularly. The thing that doesn't necessarily always get out along with the reports of the Russian missile attacks is that the Ukrainians are fighting back. They are launching drones, some of them domestic manufacturers, some of them reconfigured Chinese, some of them I don't know where else, and they are flying ungodly distances sometimes deep into Russia, and they are blowing things up and setting things on fire. And it's not just sort of to scare the Russians or cause minor problems. Already, the Russian capacity to produce finished petroleum products, there are different numbers out there, but it's like down 10% European Russia, because the Ukrainians are flying drones into Russian oil refineries and setting them on fire. And they're doing it at a pace that the Russians so far are unable to stop the drones completely. They shoot some of them down, but not all. There's an oil refinery in Rostov region that's now been burning for 10 days or 11. I forget what day it is. And it's basically gutted. This was part of the Russian National Strategic Petroleum Oil Reserve. I mean, this wasn't just somebody's business. This was designated by the Kremlin. This is where we keep reserves for, our tanks and our ships and whatever else. And a second refinery elsewhere in Rostov Oblast got set on fire, I think 3 days ago, and it's still burning. There are attacks taking place across Russia almost on a daily basis, and certainly 2 or 3 times a week. If one were to total up the number of Ukrainian strikes hitting oil refineries and air bases and whatever else across Russia over a month, and this is happening again every second day, every third day, and compare that to the damage done by the Russians in one of these like once every 40 or 50 days missile strikes. I think that it would be at least they're on par. The amount of damage done one side or the other is about even. Talk about punching above your weight. I mean, the Ukrainians
Ukrainians are, I don't want to say used to it, but it's an accepted kind of thing that this is going to happen. The Russians are going to attack into Ukraine. When Ukraine strikes into Russia, it puts pressure on Putin, who has promised his people that the stability and the chaos of the 90s, for example, and the violence of the 90s would never be returned, that order would be restored. This is not order when the Ukrainians are firing into their territory with missiles and drones. And of course, notably, and we should talk about this, is the amazing, special military operation, incursion, invasion, whatever you want to call it, by Ukrainians into Kursk. What's your take on the whole Kursk offensive?
I don't have a fully formed view yet. I'm still, like everybody else, watching and trying to figure out what the Ukrainian goals are.
But it is pretty.
It's impressive. It was okay, just without any particular priority of reactions. Number one, this has General Syrski's fingerprints all over it.
Yeah.
The General Syrski is nobody. I don't think anybody would call him a military genius on the level of Napoleon, but the guy knows his stuff. He is skilled, and he is very competent, clearly, at using his intelligence services to identify weak areas and exploit them. He knows his opponent very, very well. And the Ukrainians grabbed, you've seen the numbers. Over the course of 2 weeks, they took more terrain than the Russians had managed to take in a year and a half. And how did they do this? Well, by not seeking out fights with Russian units that they found in place, but simply driving past them, around them, and penetrating deeply behind the Russian lines, and sowing chaos and confusion, and generally moving to a mobile kind of war. You don't make that happen automatically. Soldiers, as you know, will not just go driving out to, towards the enemy for fun. That's friggin' dangerous stuff. And the Ukrainians, on a swath of territory, was like as big as Luxembourg. There's some, figures out there. Achieve that. And they couldn't have done that unless there was leadership in charge.
And the run up to it, I don't know if you heard this. I did. And I want to check with you if you heard this. In the run up to it, there was a lot of kind of the rumor mill, as it is, so, whatever, about a buildup in Sumy, which is the Ukrainian oblast on, that's adjacent to Kursk. And the thought was, that what I was hearing here in Kiev by the people that I talked to was, oh no, the Russians are about to open up another front in Sumy. That's why Ukrainian forces are massing in Sumy in a defensive posture in the expectation of Russia opening up a second front. Well, that was OPSEC. That was purposely put out there so that it would explain why Ukraine is massing troops. And Russians obviously saw it, but they said it is thought now that the Russians thought, well, they're massing troops there because they think we're going to attack there. Let them. Ha ha ha! What fools!
Yeah, I think that the Russian.
Had you heard something similar to that?
I certainly saw the report. Heck, I even went up to Sumy. I've got more than a few contacts up that way. And then I went up there, just basically I was socializing, but in any case, talking to people. Yeah, there's a lot of troops here, and we don't know exactly why, so it must mean that the Russians are about to attack. And the Russians, well, I mean, you're the Russian expert, not me. I'm like more Ukraine. But in any case, what the Russians thought of whatever information they were getting out of the Sumy region, clearly it did not penetrate down to the ground. It is obvious. I mean, it's like completely confirmed, prisoner of war interviews, video, drone observations on the ground. The Russians were caught flat-footed. There were units that had no idea what was coming, Russian units. Mm-hmm. They were hit hard. They were hit where they weren't expecting it with overwhelming force repeatedly. There were Russian, effectively, strong points or defensive positions or just, installations that got surrounded. And the first thing that they heard, apparently, I'm not saying this happened every place. There was some hard fighting. But in some places, clearly, because I've talked to prisoners of war, or I've talked to a prisoner of war, clearly sometimes the first time they heard that the Ukrainians are there is, there's a Ukrainian, it's like, we got you surrounded. Would you like to surrender or would you like to die? This is not something that happens automatically. It takes skill, it takes training, it takes organization, it takes motivation. But above all, and it takes an enemy, an opponent who just is not, who denigrates his own
I
enemy.
mean, if you are asking me what I think about the Russian side of the perspective, is yet again, I think they underestimated the Ukrainians. Russia really does have this superiority complex when it comes to Ukrainians in particular. They always think, oh, these Ukrainians, they're a bunch of farmhands. And, they've got this derogatory term, which I won't repeat for Ukrainians. It really is this kind of like, we're the great Russia and you're this little, it's very dismissive. So I love seeing them get their come-ups. Do you think Kursk is going to hold? I mean, if you
it depends on the time frame that you're talking about.
Yeah,
I think that the Ukrainians absolutely are going to be sitting there well into the fall. Because if nothing else, Vladimir Putin said, get it done by October, get him out by October. And never are these deadlines. I mean, he had as a deadline to conquer Ukraine in 3 days. That's not doing so well. So this shorter term deadline, get him out by the end of October. I think that they're going to be there at least until then, based on.
If only to stick a finger in his eye.
Yeah. Based on the amount of force available, it really, to me, doesn't look like they can move them before the end of the year. And that's only if they really get organized, and that's only if they really try.
That's going to cause a problem for them.
Because it's one thing to level a Ukrainian town, village, or city.
I mean, you already see it. You already see it in Russian, in the Russian press of this kind of like, why are we not pushing these people out? What's going on? And I think that's going to get stronger and stronger.
It's a real problem because the Russians are, militarily, they're not stupid. Strategically and operationally, they can be really big idiots sometimes. But on the tactical level, on the pure military level, they're not stupid at all. They look, they learn, they identify ways that they can get towards goals that they see that they are seeking, and they move towards them. The way that they have gained ground over the past 2 years. In very simple terms, it's more complicated and sophisticated than this. In simple terms, throw troops and firepower at it, and then just take it, flatten it, and take it over.
Yeah, they're kind of schizophrenic. Sometimes they kind of do learn lessons.
But they can do it. That's the point.
Yeah.
They have the ability to commit the troops who are willing to accept those kind of casualties. They have a population, so far, that is willing to accept that level of slow progress.
As their empires are stored,
and they have
a
media that can control the message about what's happening. Yeah. Can they sustain that forever? I don't know. But all of that has been taking place in Ukraine, where, we flattened, a city gets flattened in a battle, or let's say a town. The town gets flattened in a battle. Well, from the Russian point of view, so what? It's not in Russia. Well, now they are in Russia, these towns.
Yes.
So are the Russians willing to flatten the town in Russia to kick out the Ukrainians? Maybe there are generals who are willing to do that, but it's a lot harder to keep a secret about that. What happened, how the Russians are behaving, the kind of losses that probably would happen, because it's the same Ukrainians defending, right, in Russia and Ukraine. So, and the Ukrainians have had years to develop their defensive tactics. They know how to dig in. They know how to support their defensive with drones. They know how to put in minefields. They know how to drop mines after the Russians clear a path through a minefield. They know how to fly drones and drop mines in. I've seen that happen, actually. It's not like the Ukrainians are pushovers. Well, the Russians conducting an attack inside of Russia with the same very high losses and the very same very slow progress and the very same casualties in Russia. How does that play in Russia? It's not the same as in Ukraine, I would think. And that, I think, is slowing down probably the motivation of the Kremlin to hit the Ukrainians with everything that they have. Because
that's okay. So that's the other front. We have Kursk, and then we have what's happening down in Donbass.
Yeah.
What's your assessment of what is happening in Donbass right now? Period.
Again, I don't know. But there are two basic schools of thought. The positive school of thought from the Ukrainian point of view. General Syrskyi and the Ukrainians have a plan. Clearly, the Ukrainian military leadership in the beginning of February this year moved from a strategy of holding every possible meter of ground or foot to trading ground for Russian casualties and not dying in place and preserving force. So according to that theory. What's going on right now in the Donbas region, particularly along the Pokrovsk axis, is we are seeing the Ukrainians trade ground for time, and they are making the Russians pay a very high price. There is evidence that price is very high. There's like tons of drone video. There's anecdotal reports. The Ukrainians publish daily estimates of casualties caused, and they are near an all-time high, which is really not necessarily accurate, but it is an indicator of level of fighting and the intensity of the fighting. And it could be that the Ukrainian plan is to fall back towards Pokrovsk and there dig in and hold the Russians. But it is also quite possible, and we were seeing reports in the Ukrainian media as well. You can talk to I know Ukrainian soldiers who will say, no, what's happening is that we are seeing a slow collapse of Ukrainian forces in this sector. Our chain of command doesn't know what they're doing. Their only response to the attacking Russians is throw bodies at it. We don't have enough firepower. We are not being prepared enough. And what's going to happen if this continues is that you're going to see a total collapse of a section of the defensive line because the Ukrainian military leadership is incapable of dealing with this crisis. Between those two poles is probably the reality. But I'm not going to, it would be wrong to sugarcoat it. There is plenty of talk in Ukrainian media linked directly to Ukrainian military people, not at the top, but we're talking officially, who are saying we have a real problem in Pokrovsk and we are not convinced that the national leadership has it under control. That being said, if you had asked sort of standard Ukrainian soldier, let's say 3 months ago, does the Ukrainian army have it in it to conduct an offensive into Kursk in Russia? The answer almost certainly would have been, are you crazy? We can barely hold them around Pokrovsk and wherever else. So, I don't know. I wish I could tell you.
So you and I have collaborated a couple of times on trips out to Donbass, and we've seen the lay of the land out there, and I know you have extensively from your time when you were an OSCE monitor, for example. But not only is the lay of the land problematic, I think, for any invading force who wants to be mobile or take ground out in Donbass because of those large open areas that can be controlled from a highland position, and then it's like one Pickett's charge after another. You're going to have to, if you're the Russian army advancing into Ukrainian defenses, you're going up low sloping fields towards a strategic high point, and then doing it again and again, and that is what Donbass is, especially what we saw, like west of Chasiv Yar and this kind of stuff. So we've seen the defenses out there, and they'll make them pay. Do you think they can? I mean, Pokrovsk looks like obviously it's about to be the next, Bakhmut or Avdiivka.
Could be,
but they'll make them pay for it, just like they made them pay for it.
All comes down to firepower.
It all really comes down to firepower.
I mean, motivated troops are key, and numbers of troops are also important. But the Ukrainians are defending their own land, and the average Ukrainian unit, you put them on the ground.
You're going to hate
you say, well, let me finish up.
Yeah,
you tell the average Ukrainian fighting unit, you put them on the ground. You say, look, we can't explain it to you, but you have to hold this ground because the country needs it. A significant percentage of those soldiers probably will fight really hard and give a good account of themselves. How much pain they cause, however, it's not just up to their motivation. The key question in this day and age is how many FPV drones do they have backing them? Is it dozens? Is it hundreds? Is it thousands? If there are sectors that have been held, by to exaggerate 20 guys and 4 groups of FPV operators operating out of 4 vans, but they had so many drones and their coverage, their observation of a sector was so total that the Russians couldn't move, or more exactly, they could move, but they would get attacked. And, then there was nobody that could attack back because what was attacking them was, a little quadcopter with a grenade or an RPG round strapped to it. How do you fight that? Well, it's hard. how many of those systems, literally, I mean, it's real basic numbers. How many of those systems, like, does the standard Ukrainian defending infantry unit have behind it? You can be more conventional. I mean, I wrote a story for Kiev Post just today going, yeah, the Americans, they just put out information. We're doing great. We're making a whole lot more artillery shells. And the Europeans, same deal. The Czech foreign minister, I think yesterday, said, we are doing really well. We've given the Ukrainians hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. You talk to the soldiers on the front, Russians are out shooting us 5-1. Mm-hmm. It's like, and you look at the drone video. I mean, it's like for like a military guy. I'm not a military guy, but I talk to him. It's like it's just criminal because you get this you over and over and over. You get a Ukrainian drone over some Russians, right? And I'm neutral. I'm a journalist, so I don't really care. But you get a Ukrainian drone over some Russian infantry, and then Ukrainian artillery round comes in, and then maybe another one comes in, and no more artillery. And I mean, a long time ago, I was in the service in the U.S. Army, and they're big on artillery.
Yeah,
and the Americans. I mean, if there's a target out there that you can see, you're doing something wrong. Until it is obliterated, until it is gone,
either
then
by the air or by artillery.
So you get.
You're setting me up for too many questions here, Stefan. You got to hold off because the question that's going to bother you.
Okay, give me the bad question now.
This is the question that's going to
take a drink of water.
Okay, because I suspect I know what your response is going to be. Can they take how much more can they take, the Russians, using this?
I was ready for that question, and my answer is, you're the Russian guy. You tell me. I don't know.
You think they can take Kramatorsk?
No,
Slavyansk?
I really doubt it.
We have driven through.
Kramatorsk. Well, look, if the Ukrainian morale were to collapse, and I'm not expecting that, but if the Ukrainians quit and go home, sure, you and I have driven into Kramatorsk. They could too, against no resistance.
That is a massive. It's a big city.
Yeah,
if they're
Pokrovsk is big enough. It's hard. City fighting takes a long time, and it takes a lot of firepower, and it takes a lot of people. And from what we are seeing of the Russians, they don't have the people to take back the Kursk region and conduct a major attack into a big town or a city and prosecute it quickly.
And they're not going to be able to do it. They're not going to be able to do it before November.
No, I
can't.
I
think is key, and we can now talk about this a little bit.
Okay, go for it.
When you're talking about a lack of Western ammunition and supplies, no matter what happens in November, we're going to have a new Secretary of Defense, probably a new National Security Advisor. One way or the other, that's going to change. And if it does change to an administration that is more proactive than the current Biden administration when it comes to sending stuff, that'll be a game changer. Talk to me a little bit. Talk to me a little bit about where you think the roadblock is for Western support in terms of hardware.
Well, that's easy, but there are going to be people watching this, I think, that aren't going to like my answer. And my answer is that you are seeing a failure in leadership on the part of the U.S. government. And I do not, I include the Biden administration, but I do not, it's not just them. It is the basic problem looking at, and I'm an American, but with a basic problem with American policy towards Ukraine, from my perspective here, is that the Americans seem to think that they have a magic wand, that they just, all they got to do is decide which of their many wonderful tools do they need to apply to Ukraine, and then they'll get the policy results that they want. And it's not a question of capacity at all. It's just a question of deciding. If we, like Afghanistan, if we do the surge, yes, no, maybe it'll work. Well, if we do it and they debate for hours and years and months about whether or not this policy is going to fix things, well, that's the wrong way to approach the problem. This is a giant conventional war. It is bigger than Bosnia. It is on par with campaigns of World War II. The Russians probably have somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people mobilized for this war. The Ukrainians, not that many, but close. That's already the size of like one of the fronts in World War II. World War II was not won by a single policy decision. Are we going to give the Hellcat fighter or the Corsair fighter to the U.S. Navy? Which one? It's not. Those are no. It's how many hundreds of thousands of artillery shells coming how fast are going to give us a result in months, if not years. The scale of this, and I was like, there's like General Cavill, I think 3 years ago or 2 years ago, he said, this is a scale that we do not conceive and we have to conceive of it. Well, the problem is that the U.S. government written large, they think that Ukraine is a back burner issue. Ukraine is we'll get to it issue. Ukraine is we'll kick it down the road issue. Well, you don't win wars that way. You don't get positive outcomes in wars that way. And anybody who doesn't believe me, well, I don't know, look at the Middle East. There's, it's like it could be a lot more stable. And, it's like there's a lot of people who have sort of, maybe this little kind of marginal change, that little marginal change. But no, this is you don't want a long-running conflict. And right now, the U.S. policy is don't make a decision, don't do too much, don't anger any of the various political groups, and just accept.
The fear of escalation.
I see fear of escalation as an excuse. The real fear is making a hard decision.
Yeah. And one of the frustrating things that I'm seeing is that the inaction is a decision. Inaction is an action. This war is going to happen. This war is happening, no matter, and it's going to change Europe no matter what. Europe will not be the same after this war as before. It already isn't. It already isn't. It has changed things. So, my 2 cents is, let's make a decision.
The way I see it,
if we're going to support Ukraine, let's.
The way I see it, the American national leadership has a choice, and it's a hard choice. It is either sell Ukraine down the river and and lead Europe to a policy that basically hands over Ukrainian independence to Russia and accept a strengthened and emboldened Russian, or enable Ukraine to defend itself to the point where security, stability returns to Europe. Those are the two options. And this is really a black, white, 0-1 kind of. It's not. The in-between option is a long-running conflict that is not resolved. And, is that good or bad for Europe? I don't know, but look at the Middle East. That's what I would say.
Yeah. Stagnation. But now, along these kind of lines also, with the drip, drip, drip of support, finally we do have F-16s in the skies. What's your take on how the F-16s are being rolled out, and what are your expectations of what they can do?
Again, it's like, I'm betraying my geek background, I think, by referencing Hellcats and Corsairs in World War II. But honestly, the F-16s are a piece of the same kind of thing. I should point out that in the Kiev Post newsroom, we have a retired F-16 pilot who went to weapons school. So this guy really knows his stuff. And I pick his brain freaking all the time. So I like to think that for like a dumb civilian, I'm better informed on F-16s than some people, just because I don't let this guy out of my sight. But hey, what about this? And what about that missile? And, the Russian R-67 missile, or 37, whatever it is. But, his view is, and he loves the aircraft. He's flown thousands of arrows. And his view is, like 6 airplanes aren't going to do anything. Not if, like, God himself is behind, on the stick. 6 airplanes, war this big, that's not going to do anything. Does that mean that they're worthless? No, because everything helps. Ukraine needs to build up its air force. If you want European security, then you need to have airspace that Russia or other bad guys can't penetrate at will, which is happening right now. The Poles are getting drones blowing up in Poland. In part because the Ukrainians cannot control their own airspace. The F-16s are a step in that direction, but it's a very small step. And honestly, again, this is another example of how the United States national leadership are failing in terms of taking this conflict seriously. Because if the goal is to enable the Ukrainians to protect their skies, which is a buffer in between Russia and Europe, and if the buffer fails, then again, we have had drones, we've had missiles even, hit Poland and blow up as a result of, partially, the Ukrainians not being able to completely prevent Russian military aircraft and missiles and so on from penetrating Ukrainian airspace. If the goal is to make fighter jets part of that air defense, the F-16, as I understand it, is a fantastic airplane, really excellent for that kind of task, but it's no good without pilots. And pilots get trained where? Well, guess what? The United States has the biggest F-16 pilot training program. And I am glad to be corrected because I don't have this from official sources. But from unofficial sources, including pissed off pilots that I've talked to, the United States in any training cycle has room for two, count them two, Ukrainian fighter pilots to train on F-16s. So, at best, it's like the Americans can train up. So it's either 6 or a dozen. I don't know, but very few.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about a war where, there need to be dozens, multiple of fighter jets in order to control airspace.
Maybe that's why we need like a what is it, the Legion escadrille,
Could be. But,
get a bunch of old F-16 pilots from the West.
Could be, but this is, it's modern air war. Yeah. So, it's like, it's not just the jets. It's the crew. It's the ground crew.
Yes,
it's the mechanics. Yeah. It's the air traffic controllers. It's the guys running the air defense missiles. It is the guys running that network of acoustic sensors that are across the country that track incoming drones. It is, the grandmothers with the binoculars probably, I saw a Russian airplane. That all feeds into a data network where the Ukrainian Centralized Air Defense Command tries to figure out what the Russians are sending where in the air and then do something about it. It's really complicated. And so, you can get the F-16 pilot. I believe of Chris Stewart, great guy. The F-16 pilot, Kiev Post says you can put the best pilot in the world in an F-16, but you don't support him.
Yeah. It's not just the airframe itself.
It's a team operation.
Aside from the drip, 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 and the kind of reluctance of the West to provide everything that is needed here, in some ways the Ukrainians have reverted to taking care of themselves. For example, they've just recently, announced that they have developed with their own cruise missile that can strike deep into Russia. And we've already talked a little bit about how inventive Ukrainians can have been, but talk to me a little bit about this new cruise missile or this kind of new capacity that they're trying to build?
Well, as a reporter who's worked here for a bit, one has to take what the government says as an announcement with a big boulder of salt because, they're not chronic liars, but lots of times their ambitions are way bigger than their ability to deliver. And so they'll say, this is the plan, and they present it as what's going to happen next, and then it's not necessarily going to happen that way. They usually keep at it. They usually get a result, and they are getting better at making their messaging match what actually happens on the ground, or in this case, in the air. So with that qualification, what we are talking about is basically, if you will, an updated version of the World War II buzz bomb, right? It's a very simple jet engine, or they call it a rocket engine, and it runs efficiently. It's got wings to reduce the amount of friction so that it can go further. They say that it can operate independently of GPS. And there's several different ways to read that, but the most common way is, it's got a computer and inertial system so that it can figure out close to where it is based on internal calculations. And then when it gets to a target area, it can either hook up with GPS or by internally programmed mapping, come and hit a target. and they can do it. This is the Ukrainian thing, and they can build this thing for like $50,000. I mean, it's
very Ukrainian.
It's that I mean, it's
so Ukrainian.
it's like the you worry about what the what's the implication of the Ukrainian war. Well, if the Ukrainians ever get to a point where they don't have to send every weapon that they have against the Russians, I don't see how major manufacturers are going to be able to compete with them.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like
part of their,
I mean, if you're
GDP,
I mean, if you're like a Turkey makes a lot. Turkey makes a lot of drones. Israel makes a lot of drones. The Americans make drones. As I understand it, they're very profitable. Well, the Ukrainians are going to attack that profit margin. And what else are they?
Tried and tested.
I mean, it's like and it's like they not just tested in the biggest, most intense war since go back, blah blah blah. So. Yeah. They have a lot of ability to create weaponry to do what they think needs to be done inside Russia. This is a weapon, right? Again, blow up.
Well, necessity is the mother of invention. They have to do this because, and this is another question I'll pose to you. They feel they have to do this because of certain restrictions that the Americans in particular have given on how far they can use weaponry inside Russia. What is your take on that whole restriction thing that Washington is putting on?
This really goes back to my, if you will, sort of, and I'm not from the Eastern Coast, but you can call it Eastern Coast, egghead point of view that America decides and that the American elite know best. Well, no, it doesn't seem like that when it comes to Ukraine. It seems to me like there are a lot of people in Washington, D.C., and I'm glad to be corrected, but who make decisions, who seem to think that if we don't give the Ukrainians long-range weapons, then we are going to keep the war from escalating. And to me, that is moronic. What that policy will do is allow the war to escalate without American influence, because the Ukrainians will hit what they feel like hitting, or they feel it's in their interest to hit. And if their interests don't coincide with America's interests, so what? We don't care. I mean, it's like it's not America's job to defend Ukraine. It's Ukraine's job, and that's how they're going to make their decisions. And unless the Russians quit, then that is a recipe for escalation, because the Ukrainians certainly aren't going to quit. So how do you control that? Well, I have read in the D.C. media that there are meetings taking place, or that have just taken place, between the Ukrainian defense minister and I don't know who on the Pentagon side. And the discussion is supposedly, I wasn't there, but as I understand it, they're checking target lists for things that the Ukrainians might be able to hit, might be allowed to hit by the Americans with longer range American systems. If this is taking place, and it would be logical, but again, I don't want to say that I know, or that I got a buddy in D.C. that's telling me. I read the media like everybody else. Then that would be a way that the Americans, and I say the American leadership written large, is attempting to influence the course of events, because they have made a decision that it's better to agree with the Ukrainians ahead of time what they're going to hit deep in Russia, rather than just sort of like reading about it in Washington Post, And but again, I'm sort of like I don't know. I'm not there. I can only guess as to what's going on inside of Washington decision making, but
yeah, it's certainly let's hope that that's happening, because my take is that it doesn't do anybody any good, restricting them from hitting what they need to hit. Let's let the Ukrainians fight.
I would say that is also, but that discussion also is a distraction. I mean, it's an important discussion. It's a critical discussion in terms of steps that need to be taken in order that the war can be brought to a conclusion that is positive for the people who we think are good guys, right? Yeah. But a long debate about what individual targets need to be hit in Russia, is the oil refinery too close to a school? Those kinds of, it's like that's not a waste of time and energy, but that's not where the focus needs to be. Yeah. The focus needs to be how many million FPV drones can be put in the hands of the Ukrainian military? How many trained brigades? That's a major effort that most nation states can't handle. The United States can. Europe can. How many trained combat brigades can be fielded? When I say trained, I mean with like proper, skilled small unit leaders. And that is not something that gets created overnight. It's like fighter pilots, except that you're creating an institution rather than individuals. But it's like the training that needs to be done for, you've seen it. I mean, the Americans are good at it.
Mm-hmm.
You need a chain of command that functions. You need professionals up and down, and they all have to be working from the same doctrine. The Ukrainians are figuring that as they're going, and they're in a war. So they get a skilled leader. Well, maybe he dies or gets wounded, and then he's gone, and then they got to train somebody else. That's the kind of thing that the Ukrainians need to really have an effect on the ground. And above all, before anything else, artillery ammunition, artillery ammunition, artillery ammunition. And long discussions about, I don't know, should we give them ATACMS that, can go 250 miles or 350 miles? I mean, okay, it's a valid conversation to have, but if that conversation is distracting you from the question of why the heck has this war been going on for 2.5 years, and the Americans still only have really one factory making 155 millimeter ammunition? Still, I mean, that's not absolutely correct, because actually they're starting up another one, and there's other places that are making pieces. But 2.5 years, and the Europeans are worse. I mean, it's like the 2.5 years, well, a 2-year mark. And the Europeans effectively had not increased artillery ammunition at all. At the 2-year mark, the Czechs and then some other people said, that's it, screw it. And they've gone out on international markets. And they're delivering ammunition to the 155 millimeter ammunition to the Ukrainians, by and large, by purchasing from, the South Africans and the Indians, and secretly from the South Koreans, I guess. But in any case, where's the increase in capacity? Well, after 2 years, I can tell you where it is. It isn't there. Now, they're talking big. You can, if you read the European military news media, sure. I mean, it's like going to be quadrupled in 2028. And the question that I would ask as a guy here is, why so slow? I mean, it's like, is it in everybody's interest to drag this out? Because I don't see how. And, it's like, it's just obvious that the way that you win a war of this type is by having an overwhelming advantage in firepower. The easiest kind of firepower to give to for the Ukrainians to apply, well, we can see it's FPV drones, and then followed by that, it's artillery. I mean, we don't have to ask. We don't have to do any research. We can see. And if those agencies and states that are saying that they want to help Ukraine aren't focused on that kind of firepower, well, to me, that looks like bad policy, or at least policy that could be performed better.
You have a Ukrainian family. You live amongst the Ukrainians before the war, during the quasi-war, post 14 to 22, and now during this full thing. How are the Ukrainians holding up? What's morale in the country like? What's the morale in the armed forces like?
They're grumpy. They're just sick of it. It is, it's like the novelty of war has worn off. The idea that, here I am, I hear an air raid warning. I don't know, I go into my basement. Maybe even, I know that I sound flip, but maybe even people die somewhere, in my city. I come out of my air raid shelter. I'm a hero. No, that's all gone. People are just tired of war. War is wearing. It's boring. It's dull. It's distracting, and it's just incredibly heavy on the psyche.
You were expressing the same thing that I see here. I mean, this is it's exhausting, and it's nobody's ready to. Nobody wants to surrender. Nobody wants to, abandon.
It's normal. It's normal human reaction. The thing that makes the thing that is really the worst or the hardest is that there's death around. I mean, I don't know anybody. I don't know anybody who doesn't know people who are dead now, and includes me. And I mean, the
Me
people,
too.
God's be thanked, the people that I know who died, I didn't know them that well. And most of them like voluntarily went out and took a risk and it didn't pay off for them. And so it's not like an individual tragedy, but what about the kids and the families? And
hmm
I mean, it's like,
Well, and also living in a society where you're surrounded by pain and loss and suffering.
that's the
And
thing. That's the thing. That is,
the cost on the psyche.
it is. It is.
Yeah.
This isn't about me. The point is that that story, that experience, is literally everybody. It is pretty much impossible to find anybody in this country who doesn't know somebody who died, or who know, or and if you expand that to, or who lost a limb, or
Right.
who or whose total property, everything that they own in the world, was just completely flattened or just captured by the Russians, and so now they are refugees. And
Yeah.
it is tens of millions of people with that experience, and they continue to experience it day after day after day after day. The Ukrainians are a lot less cynical, I find, surprisingly, than cops, for instance, who have black humor, or
Right.
like emergency surgeons who deal with it that way. But the Ukrainians in general are, they're pretty humorous people, pretty ironic people,
Mhm.
and you see that kind of like on the back burner. In
Yeah.
some countries, people drink a lot more under these kinds of circumstances. I don't see the Ukrainians particularly drinking a lot more. I see them just surviving. I would imagine that people in Syria over the years would there's a lot in common. I know some people in Israel. Their life is a bit different, but there is some commonality.
Yeah.
Long-term life in a war, I mean, it's not like the kind of experience that you would wish on anybody, nor is it particularly unique because, again, tens of millions of people. But there's really no way to experience it except to experience it. And
I think there's exhaustion, but there is no loss of resolve.
No, well, I was getting to, but I mean, part of the the way that the Ukrainians are and the point to which they've gotten is that they know that this is not a sprint. They know that they have no options. They know that, sure, they could wave a white flag, let the Russians in. And then there would be things like their children would not be able to choose where they go to school, and they would not be able to elect their government. And people could get arrested and taken away to prison for no reason at all, except that, there was an autocrat in charge and they have no influence over that and laws wouldn't count. It would just all be connections. They know that that's the alternative. They have seen it. It's right next door, and they are fighting to prevent that from happening. They know that there's no way to overnight make that problem go away. So they have no alternative but just to keep fighting. You and I, again, I think I referred to this, are old enough to remember the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
We were young. And it's like,
you can't beat. I saw it in Iraq.
Yeah, we were in the. I bet you.
People who are resolved to resist you.
Yeah, I bet you did.
Will resist you.
And that's what they're going to resist, and they're never going to give up. They're never going to stop. It's their country. They cannot imagine a situation where they will bow down. And I mean, if the Russians were to come with nuclear weapons, okay, then maybe, but that's just that's not going to happen.
No.
So, and people understand that. So, it's a long, grinding, conventional war, and there are no quick fixes, and there are no easy solutions, and it's immature and naive to pretend that there are. The Ukrainians have no choice because it's their country and it's their friends, relatives, husbands, wives who are dying and being maimed. So they have to look at it honestly, in the face, the way it really is. It's harder for people who haven't gone through that experience. Yeah. And that doesn't. But that and a real key factor, I would say, is that and that includes pretty much the Russian population. Well, sooner or later, just as in the United States, it eventually dawned on a strong majority of Americans, no, these Vietnamese are not going to quit. There's nothing that we can do, nothing that we are willing to do that are going to make them quit so that we can prevail. And that message will eventually permeate to the Russian population. It's intuitive, at least on the Ukrainian side. How long? They don't know, the Ukrainians, and that's why they are not their happy, normal, fun people that they usually are. Although they're great to party with even now.
Yeah, but they do remain resolved because the alternative is unacceptable to them. Stefan, buddy,
great time.
We could keep talking, much longer. I'm sure next time I have you on, I want to talk about your experiences in OSCE monitor, but we'll leave that for another time.
Oh God, yeah.
We'll stick it out.
Okay.
The Ukrainians will stick it out.
I'm not going anywhere.
I appreciate your time and thanks for coming on.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks much.
All right, buddy. Thanks.